Well, kia ora and welcome back for another story. In this story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself growing up within the context of learning, I suppose, but we didn't see it as that at the time, but just growing up with the whānau on the Titi Islands. Now, for those of you that don't know much about the Titi Islands, the Titi season, the mutton bird season for us, happens every year for 2 months of the year. We can go down on the 15th of March, but have to be off by the 1st of June. So, growing up as a young man with our whānau, we'd all disappear out of so-called civilization for 2 months. Leave the school behind, leave the shops behind, leave electricity, running water, all of that behind, and live in the bush with the whānau, which sounds sort of romantic, growing up in that space. When we go down to the islands, there'd be, my Poua, my grandfather. There'd be probably 5 or 6 uncles and aunties. There'd be, maybe 15 to 20 cousins, and it sounds like a lot of fun. But it's just like sort of Christmas Day, really. It's fun for the first couple of hours, and then we all start fighting. But it's like having Christmas for 2 months of the year. But you got to know who the whānau was. You got to know each other. You really got to respect and to understand each other. So it was a fantastic way of being brought up. And when we'd go down there, the hopu Titi, the collection of Titi, of mutton bird, was a family-wide activity. And it was dictated to by the Poua, by the grandfather who would teach the youngers, the young people, how to bird. And I remember growing up within that context, being sort of 6 or 7 years old or even younger, and the first job that I'd have at the first half of the season, these 2 halves of the TT season, was to carry the birds from where Poua was catching them over to where they're being plucked. Now, in the first half of that season, the birds, they actually live in burrows under the ground. So you have to crawl around the ground and put your arm down the hole in the ground and take the birds out. And I remember watching the old fella, he'd be crawling around the ground, and he'd know intimately the ways that the holes went because they'd head off in different directions. And I remember him saying to me, he said, "Oh, rightio boy, we'll come up to this one. There'll be a bird right about here." He'd put his arm in the hole, you'd see him twist around, and he'd pull a bird out. He had that knowledge of the place, that knowledge of going there for so many seasons, that he knew the holes that the birds lived in. So he had that that intimate knowledge of that place, of how it worked, of how the trees worked. The trees down there, the main trees on our island are called tupari. They've got a very shallow root system and a high canopy at the top. Perfectly designed for the birds to burrow under, with the roots providing the structure for the holes, but also with the canopies on top, with Titi being seabirds, they only make landfall on our island. So out at sea, they're sweet as they can land with their little feet up in the air. But on the island, they crash into the canopy and the trees and they fall down. So everything works in this beautiful, beautiful ecosystem of the tupari trees, or the bunui. That's a good southern Māori word for you, bunui. That provides the nursery for the younger trees growing up as the older ones go down. So everything within that ecosystem works in together. And the old fella, he knew how everything worked. But I remember, getting back to the story, as a young fella, watching him catch the birds and carrying them, sort of half a dozen birds at a time, back to where they're being plucked, back to where the uncles and mum were processing the birds. And as I got older and learnt the trade a little bit more, as I got taught how to process the birds, first I got to pluck the backs because they're the easiest to pluck, and then the fronts of the birds as your hands strengthen up and you learn the tricks of the trade. The processing of the birds includes the plucking, the cutting off of the wings and the legs, the dipping in wax to get rid of all the downs underneath. Then the birds are hung overnight and then gutted, put in buckets. So, growing up in that context, we're working 10, 12-hour days, sort of minimum. It's a great way to be brought up as a kid. But all the way through that, I remember sitting beside the Poua, sitting beside the grandfather, and him telling stories, which was a wonderful thing in reflection, upon reflection. But the second half of the season down there, the birds come out at night, and that's when they're getting ready to get rid of their downs and to leave the island. So when they come out, they like the wind and they like the rain. So, you can sort of imagine living in a shed and you hear the wind and the rain outside. As soon as those first drops hit the flat iron of the side of the house, you'd hear the Poua's feet hit the floor. And it'd be, "Rightio boy, away we go." It's like, oh no, it's cold and wet outside. But you'd get up, go out and do a round, walk around the bush at night with the torches catching birds, second half of the season. But part of that as well was sitting once again and plucking the birds. And I remember vividly, I've got vivid memories of the old fellow, of the old Poua sitting over here, of my uncle sitting here, of me here in this little circle. We'd have about 100 birds to pluck. Mum out the side cutting the wings and legs off at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the old fella just telling stories, telling stories about George Portnick and his wire that ran from one hill to the other, and in the bad seasons he'd run the birds down the hill so he wouldn't have to carry them all down, etc., etc. About going over to Matchhead where the kinnies were and having a night over there. So one of the traditions on the island was going and giving people a night. You go and work for them for a night to help them out. But how one season, there was one bottle of whiskey too many consumed, and it was a bit hard getting back in the dark. About which families went to watch spots, about where the boundaries were, where the gullies, where the creeks, and all of this stuff. And I remember these stories the old Poua telling me in the middle of the night, on those cold, wet, rainy nights in a tin shed, over and over and over again. And I'd be sitting there as a teenage boy thinking to myself, "Oh shit, Poua, I've heard these stories before. Haven't you got any new ones?" But him just retelling those stories, him just telling the stories of the place, of the people, of the environment, of the birds, of that whole context, and just passing that knowledge on and watching. I remember him watching everything that we did when we were plucking the birds. He'd go, "Oh boy, you might want to do a bit better next time," and making sure that we got our craft right of the catching the birds, the processing the birds, of the place, And I get now that what he was doing was he was passing on those stories of that context as in its entirety, not just the birds as they exist as a standalone unit of production, if we could sort of chuck a Marxist term in, but actually the birds who live in that island and in those waters. So looking after the island, the trees and the water, of the people that come and the relationships that were made. So every time he told and retold that story, he was making sure that we got it. He was making sure we got the details of what was happening within that. But he was interesting in the way that he transferred that knowledge with myself and with my brother. Now, I always thought that he was giving me a whole heap of stuff, but it turns out that I was a wee bit of a, I'd like to go play on the water and have a bit of a dive and chase the other cousins around the bush with knives and vegetation. But that's another bunch of stories as well, and do a lot of playing. But my younger brother, he was a bit of a strange turkey. He'd just hang around beside the old Poua all the time, and he'd sit beside him and listen to him and watch every single thing that he did. Part of that production line of getting birds is, of processing the birds, is when we gut them and salt the birds down for preservation. As far as I was concerned, that was it. The job was over, it was done. But the old guy would hang around the workhouse for another 3, 4, 5 hours, and the little brother would hang around beside him, asking him questions all of the time. And I used to think, sucker, you're missing out on playtime. But I worked out later on, when I became what's known as a part-time birder, as sort of time went by, I got interested in other things. I found other pursuits. And my brother, he decided that he would be the full-timer. It actually transpired that the old fella sort of saw that in him. And he gave him more knowledge than he gave me, because he saw that that was the receptacle to put that knowledge, to put those lessons. And, when the old fella spoke, we listened, because he had that knowledge that was passed on from the people a couple of generations above him. And that's sort of loosely speaking, that's the way that knowledge transfer system works. The old fella gives the knowledge to 2 generations underneath, and it sort of gets transferred in that way, if that makes sense. And I remember, our grandfather, our Poua, talking about our Poua Dago, and I think it was appropriate to use terms like that back in the day. Maybe not now, but learning that trade from old Poua Dago, and talking about the houses that they lived in then, which were the old pahuri. They were round houses that were made out of the vegetation on the island. So nothing as flash as flat iron houses back in their day. It was just these old dirt floors, etc. And when he told us those stories about the old days, they could just sort of see the knowledge being handed down there as well. Well, and obviously see it now. And we knew that his knowledge, therefore, was real, if that makes sense. It was real insofar as it was traditional, and I've got to be really careful with that word, because I struggle with the word traditional insofar as it could contain, it could be used as a limiting word, an essentialisation word, but I won't get into that just now. But that old traditional knowledge with a new modern twist. So, when I talk about salting the birds and waxing the birds, when the old guy was learning, when the old fellow was learning, they'd water clean the birds. So they'd get the birds, dip them really quickly in hot water, and then rub all of that under down off. Whereas with me growing up, we had the new technology of wax. Drop the birds in the wax, wait till it dries and crack it off. The old people used to go down in the waka, in the old canoes, then in diesel boats, then in helicopters. Hey, and why not? So we knew the knowledge that he had was that real old knowledge from back 100 years ago, from the dirt floor days. But it was also contained the new knowledge that was gathered, and he passed that all on. So I sort of see that now, that the younger brother, he might have been, and he tells me now, actually, he says he was Poua's favourite. He gave him all the gifts of the knowledge. He knew that the brother was going to do something with it, whereas I was just running around the bush or playing in the city or whatever. And I see now how that works, at the fullness of time, that he was actually Poua's favourite, but luckily my brother knows that I was Mum's favourite, so that's... But it's interesting, even in my life now, I see how that identifying people who have an affinity to knowledge works. And I'll tell you a story about my cousin's boy, my cousin Rako, her boy, which is what generation, maybe 2 generations below me. Oh, he is really, I suppose. But anyway, we were out in the bush one day looking for these bunui. You don't have to look far. Now, bunui are an interesting plant because they only grow on our islands down there. They're known as a mega herb. And back in the day, the old people used to eat them. But for the last generation or so, we've stopped eating them because it's easy to take a couple of cabbages down there, to harvest these plants on the island. They grow on a long stalk with a big leaf on top, looks similar to a rhubarb. But because we'd lost that connection to that food source and to the practices of where to gather and how to harvest that food, myself and my cousin a couple of seasons ago, we said, let's go and have a look and we'll get back into these things. And she said, well, take the boy along with us because he eats everything in the forest. Now, luckily, of course, down here you can pretty much do that. But yeah, he was an interesting little character. He was only 5-6 years old, and he'd go around the bush and just taste. Just taste the things. And when we were talking to him, we said, boy, what part of the bunu do we eat? There was one part, we broke the stalk, and I got a big piece of stalk, and I said, what would this be like? He goes, I don't know, taste it. And I ate this piece of plant, and it was really bitter. And he said, don't eat the green one, eat the white part, which of course makes sense because the green is full of chlorophyll. Now, he worked this out by trial and error. he knew just by walking through the bush which parts to eat and which not to. But it was really interesting, and I don't know if he's being a smart ass or what he was up to. But when I asked him what the best part was to eat, he wouldn't answer. He let me find that out for myself. So, he would have been the type of young fella that would have been given the knowledge, the appropriate knowledge from the old people, from those tohunga that knew everything about, about that bush food, about the rongomatane, about, haumi e tiki, about all of those foods from that bush. He would have been the one that was given that knowledge, because he would have been the appropriate person for that. But now we have to build that knowledge up again, and see how that works. So, in reflection now, as an education practitioner, actually I must be a professional because I get paid to do it, but I can see now how growing up within that context of going to the Titi Islands has informed who I am as a practitioner, but in a subtle, embedded way, in a way that allowed for that traditional knowledge to be transferred through a system that reached the right people at the right time. But also, as I said right from the outset, it was about knowledge, and the whole system was about commerce. Even when we looked at, we come back home, we trade the birds, it was part of our traditional economies, but we never actually saw it as a learning process or as a business-based process, as an economic process. It was just who we were and what we did. It was about living in that environment with all of those natural elements, understanding how everything works in together, understanding our place within that, and understanding how, I suppose, vitally lucky we are, or we are, and hopefully will be in the future, to have the ability to access that place, the food, our own identity, our connections to people, our connections to whānau and to our cousins, even though 2 months with your cousins is a hell of a long time. So, so once again, thanks for listening to this story. And I'll refresh and tell you another one soon.